Aspects of Naruto that you'll never be able to find in any other anime out there. Things like Sage Mode and Reaper Death Seal and individual ninja villages that have warred for decades coming together to battle against aliens. But there is definitely also aspects of Naruto that you can find in pretty much every other piece of fictional media, at least so far as it pertains to anime. The concept of chakra has been done in a gajillion different ways, whether it be cursed energy, nen, Ryatsu, mana, magic. Usually when it comes down to an anime power system, they're given some kind of quantifiable way to measure how much power somebody is able to use or is currently using. On top of that, the concept of summoning little monsters to battle alongside of you is also something we've seen in a lot of anime. Digimon, Pokemon, Shaman King, even solo leveling, and thus to say that everything that Naruto has ever done reinvented the wheel is just inaccurate. But it doesn't mean that the way that Naruto went about these relatively well-used tropes wasn't unique in its own right. And in no category is that more true than in the summoning of these monsters. See, because here's the thing. Usually when there's a summoning mechanic in an anime, like Fate or Pokemon or even solo leveling, the summoning aspect is usually only for one type of thing. Solo leveling, it's for Jinwoo's Shadow Army. Pokemon, it's for Pokemon. Digimon, it's for Digimon. Fate, it's for heroes from the past. But in the Naruto universe, one is able to summon a myriad of different things, whether that be a giant turtle, a legendary sword, or another person, or I guess themselves. The word summoning can mean a whole lot of different things in the Naruto universe, because a summoning for Kakashi and Tenten look massively different, and thus when you're trying to approach in a video explaining all of the manga canon summonings in Naruto, you can technically be looking at a bit of a Herculean task, as technically everything that's ever been summoned can count as a summoning. But fortunately, when you say the word summoning to any Naruto fan, 90% of their brains are gonna go immediately to a summoning animal. So the Herculean task becomes just a little bit simpler. Now, the reason I say just a little bit simpler is because there's 45 manga canon summoning animals, which is why I've been avoiding making this video for 3.5 years.
But Nick, why are you so focused on the manga canon aspect of it?
Because if you include all Naruto IP, that is video games, the anime, and the manga, and light novels, there's 68 summoning animals. And with the way I approach videos, that would be a 2.5-hour video. And 45 entries on a list video is still the most I've ever done. But I have been putting off making this video for 3.5 years, and it's about time I get it out of the way. Now, if one day we ever hit 1 million subscribers on this channel, which probably will never happen, I will rank and explain every single anime, light novel, manga, and video game animal summoning. But since we're still a long way off from that goal, for the moment, we're just gonna explain every single summoning animal in the manga. So sit back and relax, because today we got a real long one, because today we're talking every manga canon animal summoning in Naruto explained. But before we get to explaining anything, guys, please, for me, like this video, subscribe to the page, and hit that noti bell. And if you like the idea of me breaking my back trying to make long old videos for you, then you're gonna love my other channel, The Weeb Commander, where instead of talking about Naruto and Boruto, I talk all other manga and anime. And if you just love the idea of me talking about all your favorite manga and anime, you're gonna love my anime podcast, Otaku's Anonymous, where me and Danny Mata break down everything that happened in anime this week. It's available on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. So, 45 summoning animals. Now, technically, me saying 45 summoning animals is a bit disingenuous, because I am going to be considering all of Kakashi's Ninken as one summoning as opposed to the 8 summonings that they technically are. But even with that, we're still talking about 38 entries. And as somebody who usually cuts himself off at around 15 entries because they tend to yap, this is going to be quite the video. And because just the process of trying to explain 45 summonings is going to be so difficult and so time consuming, I'm not going to be ranking these summonings by strength just quite yet. See, I want this video to act as a supplementary amount of knowledge to help a ranking video down the line. Because when ranking things in any anime universe against each other, I have to not only explain that thing, but also explain why it might be weaker or stronger than the thing above or below it. And honestly, explaining what the thing is and explaining why it's stronger or weaker than something are equal parts in a video like that in terms of effort and length. So today we're going to be focusing on information, while in a couple of weeks we'll focus focus on ranking. But since we won't be ranking these summoning animals and instead just explaining them, there's no better way to do this other than alphabetical, which technically makes the first entry we would talk about Akino. But Nick, who's Akino, you ask? Great question. Akino is one of Kakashi's Ninken, one of Kakashi's 8 Ninken. But since Ninken starts with an N, we'll get to all of those Ninken when we hit N, which makes our first real entry Aoda. Now, for those of you who don't remember, Aoda is kind of Sasuke's second snake. See, Aoda is a massive summoning snake that resides in Ryuchi Cave. And after Manda is killed, technically by Deidara, but also technically by Sasuke in the battle between Sasuke and Deidara, when Sasuke summons Manda as a pseudo-meat shield against Deidara's final explosion, Sasuke needs a new snake. But then again, so does Orochimaru, as both Orochimaru and Sasuke shared Manda, but Manda hated Sasuke, but pledged loyalty to Orochimaru, and because he had to listen to Orochimaru, he had to work with Sasuke. Now, Aoda is very different from Manda in this one key aspect. See, while Aoda is roughly the same size as Manda 1, but not Manda 2, Aoda is stated to have a strength that rivals that of both of the Mandas. And therefore, strength isn't where Aoda differentiates itself from the Mandas or really any of the other giant snakes from Ryuchi Cave, but instead where Aoda differentiates itself is that as a snake, it's incredibly mild-tempered, not only expressing the fact during Boruto that it had no interest in consuming humans, but also Aoda respects Sasuke, his summoner, so much that he refers to him as Sasuke-sama, and he's so loyal to Sasuke that his loyalty actually extends to that of Sarada, as in the Mitsuki Retrieval arc, which is an anime canon arc in Boruto. And when Boruto and a couple of members from the new generation of Konoha go to Ryuchi Cave, Aoda protects them from Garaga's attacks. And therefore, Aoda is kind of your run-of-the-mill giant snake with the ability to cut down Ten Tails clones and strong enough to participate in the three-way deadlock, but also Aoda has the temperament of a Lady Katsuyu or Gamabunta, and not a Manda, making him an incredibly important asset to not only Sasuke, but Sarada. Now, after Aoda, we have another four-lettered summoning, because coming up second, we have Baku. Now, Baku was the personal summoning of Danzo, the elephant, crimson chin tiger. Baku, just like Aoda, is massive, big enough to dwarf Sasuke's armored Susanoo, though obviously not his complete Susanoo, which Sasuke didn't have in his battle against Danzo. Now, Baku is said to be a somewhat mythical creature, and this is because the Baku that Danzo summons is based off an actual mythological Japanese creature, Baku, which are said to devour dreams and nightmares, which is something that Danzo's Baku is said to be able to do by Obito. Now, the Baku in Japan actually originates from the Chinese mythological animal known as the mole. In actuality, while in Naruto, the Baku claims to consume dreams and nightmares, in Chinese and Japanese folklore, the Baku only consumes nightmares, acting as a kind of mythical creature dream catcher, if you shall. That is to say that the Baku is supposed to be a caretaker of the sleeping world, a creature that consumes your nightmares so that you're not constantly plagued by them. Now, this is visualized in the Naruto universe by the Baku that Danzo summons, just really sucking things up. See, the Baku has an enormous suction ability that it can activate by opening its mouth and breathing in. A suction ability so great that it can ignore any debris that flies into its mouth and keep on sucking. Kind of like your mom. We all knew where it was going, I'm sorry. But kind of like when you were drinking milk in middle school and somebody made you laugh, Baku, while sucking things in, also shoots things out of its nose, using its own suction as a vacuum of sorts to increase its wind release, which also increases Danzo's wind release, which is often used in conjunction with it. And the suction that the Baku was able to create was so incredibly powerful that it was able to immobilize Sasuke's Susanoo, and even augment wind release fired by Danzo that was able to destroy Sasuke's Susanoo. However, because it's constantly sucking everything down, like your mom, its inherent weakness is things fired into its mouth that are a bit spicy, like fire release, which is how Sasuke ends up defeating the Baku in the first place. But enough of the sucking jokes, let's move on to our third entry on this list, which is the Boiler Toad. And a lot of you are probably wondering, as you're going to do multiple times throughout this video, Nick, what's the Boiler Toad? Great question. Not exactly the most important summoning animal of all time, but the summoning animal that comes from Chapter 22 of Boruto, also known as Episode 187 of Boruto. That has to be one of the wildest anime statistics ever said out loud. 187 episodes to adapt 22 chapters of manga. That is all-time bad. But anyways, we don't know a whole lot about the Boiler Toad outside of the fact that it was summoned by Kashin Koji to crush Ao. See, for those of you who don't remember, Ao was an outer of Kara, and he was assigned to the recovery of Kawaki. But when he failed this mission after being defeated by Team 7, Kashin Koji summoned this possibly Amado-created giant toad to fall out of the sky and crush Ao's body, killing Ao in that moment. Now that and the fact that after Amado battles against Jigen and forces him to turn to Ishiki, the same Boiler Toad eats up Kashin Koji's body and teleports Kashin Koji away from that battlefield is basically all we know about this Boiler Toad. But in appearance, it appears to be roughly the same size as medium-sized toads like Gamatatsu or Gamakichi before the Fourth Great Shinobi World War. Like big enough to fit an entire human in its mouth, but not as big as Gamaken or Gamabunta or Gamakichi by the time the Fourth Great War came around. But it does, unlike the other toads, appear to be armored and have some kind of exhaust vents on its back, which looks somewhat comparable to the jet vents that Jugo's able to grow on his body. Now after the Boiler Toad, we have a very different kind of summoning, because after the Boiler Toad, we have the demonic statue of the Outer Path, also known as the Gedo Statue. And yes, this is a summoning animal. It is the husk of the Ten Tails that is summoned from the moon to the earth by Madara, and then subsequently summoned by Nagato in the battle against Hanzo and Danzo. Now obviously the Gedo Statue is a bit different from any other summoning animal on this list because you need the Rinnegan to summon it, but it's also a lot more powerful than any other summoning animal on this list. Give you a little hint about who might come out at number 1 in the all summoning animals ranked video. However, on top of the fact that you need a Rinnegan to summon the Gedo Statue, there's also another key difference that comes along with summoning the Gedo Statue as opposed to summoning literally any other summoning animal. And that key difference is, while summoning any other animal summoning requires a blood sacrifice, summoning the Gedo Statue when it's not powered by the power of all the other tailed beasts drains the life force of the summoner, which is why when Nagato summons the Gedo Statue for the first time, it shoots a bunch of chakra rods into his back and makes him emaciated. And the only reason that Nagato was able to survive this drain of his life force was because of his Uzumaki lineage. However, like many things in Naruto, this isn't necessarily consistent, as both Obito and Madara both summoned the Gedo Statue and never saw the same emaciating effects that Nagato did, with Madara even going so far, and this could possibly just because of how impressive he was, as using a blood summoning to summon the Gedo Statue as opposed to giving up his life force. Now, why is it different for Nagato than it is for Madara and Obito? Kishimoto forgot, and also because it would be slightly inconvenient for either Obito or Madara to be emaciated, but they did need the Gedo Statue? So is it a plot hole? Kind of. But summoning the Gedo Statue is hard because the Gedo Statue is ridiculously powerful. With the Gedo Statue itself, even when separated from the chakra of the Ten Tails, holding so much power that even if all of the chakra of the Ten Tails is extracted from a Ten Tails Jinchuriki, so long as the Gedo Statue remains in the Ten Tails Jinchuriki, they can stay alive. On top of this, the power of the Gedo Statue is so incredibly powerful that Madara was able to extend his life long beyond its natural end simply by siphoning off chakra from the Gedo Statue. And that's just how powerful it is sitting down. But when it gets up and starts fighting people, it's strong enough to go up against Choji and Chozo, two heads of the Akamichi clan, both in their colossal forms simultaneously, and win. On top of this, it's able to emit dragon-type ninjutsu that when it comes into contact with a person, immediately kills them and drains them of all of their chakra. And it's through the medium of this dragon absorption ninjutsu that the members of the Akatsuki were able to pull out tailed beasts from the Jinchuriki, though the process did take several days. And this isn't even the only way in which the Ten Tails can absorb chakra from tailed beasts, as the Gedo Statue is also able to fire out chakra chains comparable to that of the adamantite chains that bear curse seals that once they come into contact with tailed beast chakra, seal off their chakra and pull those tailed beasts into the Gedo Statue. And these chains can either be used on Jinchuriki to pull the tailed beast out of them, or just on tailed beasts. And considering the fact that it was able to use these chains to overpower 9 tailed beasts simultaneously, this would imply that the Gedo Statue, without any chakra of its own, is still relative to 9 tailed beasts, which means that the Gedo Statue is almost as powerful as the chakra that was separated from it. So, all in all, pretty impressive. But since we're talking about creepy summonings with no eyes, after the demonic statue of the Outer Path, we have the Doki, also known as the 3 summonings of Teyuya of the Sound Village 5, the flute genjutsu girl. Now, the Doki are a reference to the 3 wise monkeys, which are 3 monkeys in Japan that embody the principle of hear no evil, see no evil, speak no evil. You know, and thus each and every single one of these Dokis either has their mouth covered, their eyes covered, or their ears covered. Now, every single one of the 3 Dokis is 15 to 20 feet tall. And one not really bearing anything. Its arms are wrapped against its body. It seems kind of useless as a summoning, but I guess it still has legs. Now, Tsuyu has the ability to control all three of these Doki through her flute, and every single one of these Doki is incredibly powerful. So powerful that they're able to swing their weapons through trees. They're also fast and agile, and as Tsuyu is able to augment exactly how they move through the sounds of her flute, it allows for her to stay substantially far away from the battlefield while controlling three very powerful summonings. On top of this, if Tsuyu wants to get truly serious about the battle, she can begin to play the melody of her finale, which is known as Revolt of the Demon World, which forces open the mouths of all of her Doki and releases a chakra worm of sorts, made almost entirely out of spiritual energy. And this worm, released from the mouths of the Doki, is immediately attracted to any source of physical energy nearby. Now, for those of you who don't remember, chakra is created of two key components, physical energy and spiritual energy. And therefore, this entirely spiritual energy mouthworm is looking for physical energy to complete its balance and to create chakra. However, since physical energy is only found in humans, this means that the mouthworm will attack any nearby humans and drain them of all of their physical energy and therefore their chakra. But since these mouthworms are made entirely out of spiritual energy, they technically don't have a form, so there's no way to stop or attack them. And thus the only way to get rid of them is to either dispel the Doki or stop Tsuyu from playing her song. And genuinely, if we're being real with ourselves, the fact that Shikamaru was able to defeat Tsuyu, well, I guess it's more like the fact that Tamari was able to defeat Tsuyu, is kind of crazy because Tsuyu's kit is broken and would play pretty well even in Boruto. But Tamari and Shikamaru were two of the stronger Genin / Chunin in part 1 of Naruto, so I guess it's not crazy that the two of them were able to team up to take her down. But still, man, when it comes to kits in all of Naruto, hers is to this day one of my favorite. But speaking of things that are my favorite, coming up after the Doki, we have Monkey King Enma, who was the personal summoning of Hiruzen Sarutobi. Now, I've put it on record multiple times that I believe that Monkey King Enma is one of the strongest summonings in all of Naruto. And outside of Tamari's Sickle Weasel, Monkey King Enma is my favorite summoning. But at the same time, Monkey King Enma is also one of the least unique summonings in all of Naruto. See, Monkey King Enma is very obviously based off Sun Wukong. But let us say that Monkey King Enma and Hiruzen, when put together, are meant to symbolize Sun Wukong. Because Sun Wukong is not only the king of the monkeys, but also has a staff like Goku that's able to extend endlessly. And thus Hiruzen wielding this staff is supposed to be a reference to Sun Wukong, while Monkey King Enma being the king of the monkeys is supposed to be a reference to Sun Wukong. Package deal. And here's the thing, Monkey King Enma being based on one of the strongest fictional creatures of all time makes a fair amount of sense, actually. Because while we haven't seen a ton from Monkey King Enma, as the majority of his feats do come from Hiruzen's battle against Orochimaru, Monkey King Enma is essentially just a Hokage. He's a prehensile, intelligent ape that's as strong as Hiruzen. And while Hiruzen is the summoner and Monkey King Enma is the summonee, Enma was enough in terms of power to even the playing field between Hiruzen, Orochimaru, Tobirama, and Hashirama simultaneously. As Enma was not only strong enough to battle against Tobirama and Hashirama in hand-to-hand combat for a fair amount of the Hiruzen and Orochimaru battle, evenly, but also it's not even technically the strongest thing that Enma can do. See, Enma has the ability to transform into an infinitely extendable adamantite staff. And since adamantite is the strongest material in Naruto, this form makes him basically invulnerable, with the only thing that ever even managed to hurt him in this form being Orochimaru's Kusanagi blade, which is supposed to be able to cut anything. But Monkey King Enma is so strong in this form that by extending, he was able to push a full-powered Kurama out of Konoha. On top of this, while in this form, Monkey King Enma is still able to make parts of his body appear on the staff, like feet, hands, and eyes, and therefore he can still move while in this form, and still use ninjutsu, like clone techniques, as Enma was able to multiply himself to make a prison wall of sorts that was able to stop Hashirama's wood release. On top of this, a heavily injured Enma was also able to stop Orochimaru's Kusanagi blade to a certain degree, which Orochimaru is able to control telekinetically. So yeah, Enma's one of the strongest summonings in all of Naruto, and I love him. Which is why next up we're going to be talking about Enma's grandson, Enra. Just kidding. No, we're not. He doesn't appear in the manga. He's actually anime canon. In the manga, Konohamaru doesn't have a summoning, which is painful. But then again, Konohamaru barely exists in the manga, so I guess it makes sense. No, after Monkey King Enma, we have another king, at least in our hearts, Fukasaku. Now, some of you might not know the name Fukasaku, and for those of you who don't, Fukasaku is Pa from Ma and Pa, one of Jiraiya's summons. Now, Fukasaku is over 800 years old and is one of the heirs of the Great Toad Sage, and him him and his wife Shima, Ma, are referred to as the two great sage toads. Now, it was Fukasaku who greeted Jiraiya when he accidentally reverse summoned himself to Mount Mubuko, and therefore it was Fukasaku that trained Jiraiya, and it was Fukasaku who trained Naruto. Now, Fukasaku and Shima are treated with a massive amount of respect in Mount Mubuko, as they're considered to be the oldest and wisest amongst the toads that are still, you know, not just sitting in a chair talking about their dreams. However, Fukasaku and Shima, while they are the oldest and wisest, are often found bickering about things that don't necessarily matter, when they should be concerned about much greater problems. But when you've been married for 700 years, I guess that kind of thing happens. Now, even though Fukasaku and Shima are 800 years old, this doesn't mean that they're not incredibly formidable in battle, as not only are they the only toads that know the words to the demonic illusion toad confrontation chant, a sound-based genjutsu that's able to place anybody who hears it under a deadly genjutsu that either they can only be released from if Fukasaku and Shima decide to release them, or through their own death by having one of the stone toads jam their sword into the heart of the person being placed under genjutsu. But the thing about the demonic illusion toad confrontation chant is that it requires two people singing, and thus this genjutsu can't be done unless both Fukasaku and Shima are singing, as it requires harmonization. On top of that, this genjutsu cannot be used repeatedly, as using it even once makes the throat of the user incredibly sore. Now, on top of genjutsu, Fukasaku also can use wind release and water release in the anime, but in the manga, the only elemental release we see him use is wind release, which he uses in conjunction with Jiraiya's oil and Shima's fire to create a level of fire release unparalleled by 99.99% of fire release users. And that ability is Sage Art Goemon, a technique so powerful that Jiraiya can turn anybody hit by it into cinders in an instant. On top of this, in the anime, Fukasaku was shown to have water release so powerful he was able to cut one of Pain's summoning animals in half. Oh, and did I mention that he's a perfect sage? And Fukasaku was so incredibly well versed in pulling in nature energy and blending it with his own that he's been shown to be strong enough while activating his Senjutsu chakra to be able to throw Gamabunta a long distance. In fact, Gamakichi once said that Fukasaku has the ability to amass a massive amount of sage chakra in an instant, while people like Jiraiya, Hashirama Minato, and even Hashirama have to constantly pull in Senjutsu chakra and mix it with their own to maintain their sage mode. And the same applies to Shima, which is why when they're summoned by Jiraiya, he fuses them to his shoulders so they can pull in nature energy for him, which allows for him to battle while they stand still and pull in and create Senjutsu chakra, which gives Jiraiya a form that is almost as strong as peak power Nagato in his own backyard. It's an absolutely massive boost. But enough about that scrub, let's get on to the real summonings, like Fukuemon. You remember Fukuemon, right? I have a tattoo of him. You don't remember Fukuemon? The prolific summoning of Matoi? You don't remember Matoi? Killer Beast's childhood friend who's stationed on Genbu? You don't remember Genbu? The giant island turtle? It's an owl. Fukuemon is an owl that Matoi uses to send messages between the Hidden Cloud and Genbu. But hey, in Naruto Mobile, Fukuemon helps Matoi in battle, so scale that. But staying in the vein of incredibly powerful and important summonings, next up we have Gama, who is actually the first named toad we ever see in Naruto. And while amongst the toads, Gama is kind of irrelevant, he does pop up a fair amount. See, Gama is the keeper of the toad summoning scroll, and thus anybody who wants to become a summoner of the toads has to meet Gama first. And therefore, this is the first toad that we actually ever see appear alongside Jiraiya. Now, Gama actually should have been the toad that I compared the boiler toad to in terms of size, because Gama is big enough for Jiraiya to ride on, and also big enough to hold the toad summoning scroll in its mouth, but is not a massive toad. Though Gama's size is somewhat inconsistent, because while sometimes Gama appears to be big enough that he dwarfs Jiraiya in size, and therefore Jiraiya can ride on Gama, when Gama is summoned to protect Naruto against Kisame, Gama looks smaller than Kisame. And as Jiraiya himself is like 6'3", 6'4", that would mean that Gama is smaller than Jiraiya, which would be weird. But Gama as a toad is mostly focused on taijutsu, with which he's actually incredibly skilled, as he in his samurai armor was able to block an attack from Samehada when wielded by Kisame. On top of this, Gama was able to effortlessly dispatch Ebisu, who is a jonin, though a tokubetsu jonin. And that's the last time we see Gama, whose name literally just means toad. Probably because there was other, more interesting toads who have the ability to talk, though Gama's necklace does read loyalty, and I love that. But I hope you guys like talking about toads, because when you get to the G's, there's a lot of them. Now after Gama, we have the chief toad of Mount Mubuko, Gamabunta, who's commonly just referred to as Bunta because, once again, Gama just means toad. Now, Gamabunta, for all intents and purposes, is probably the strongest toad from Mount Muabuko, as Gamabunta has been summoned by some of the strongest toad sages in history, those being Jiraiya, who used him during the Second Great Shinobi Worlds War, Minato, who used him on the night of Naruto's birth to hold down Kurama, and Naruto, who uses him in a myriad of different times. And thus Gamabunta has been the toad involved in the three-way deadlock through 2 separate generations. And as probably the strongest toad from Mount Muabuko, Gamabunta has done some fairly impressive things, like something I've already referenced, the fact that on the night of Naruto's birth, Gamabunta was summoned from the sky using the food cart destroyer technique, which is a real name for a jutsu, which is literally just summoning a toad in the sky and having it fall onto something. And after he was summoned to Konoha by Minato, he was told by Minato to hold down Kurama until Kurama could teleport him out of Konoha using his flying Raijin. And while Gamabunta said even he wouldn't be able to hold down Kurama for all that long, he was able to hold down Kurama for long enough. And this isn't the only time that Gamabunta has taken on a tailed beast, as Gamabunta was literally turned into Kurama to battle against Shukaku. And while Shukaku is maybe the weakest tailed beast out of all of them, being able to go toe-to-toe with any of the tailed beasts as a summoning animal is very impressive. Now, a lot of Gamabunta's strength comes from his Kenjutsu. That is to say that a lot of his abilities come from the massive blade that he wields. So Gamabunta is somewhere from 60 to 90 feet tall, which means that the blade that he wields is somewhere in the region of 30 to 40 feet long, meaning anything that gets hit by it usually doesn't get back up, like Pain's multi-headed summoning dog, though it actually did get back up. That's kind of the entire purpose of Pain summoning animals. But with this blade, referred to as a tanto in Japanese, Gamabunta has done more than just piercing the head of Pain summoning dogs, as he's also done things like slicing off one of Shukaku's arms. And if Gamabunta doesn't want to use his tanto, he can also spew massive amounts of toad oil or use high-level water release. But he usually uses the toad oil in conjunction with his summoner's fire release in order to create a massive flame that scorches anything in his way. And thus Gamabunta is feared as one of the strongest summoning animals in all of Naruto, and a bona fide member of the three-way deadlock for a reason. But enough about that scrub of a toad, let's get to some more important toads, like Gamahiro, who's a giant toad comparable in size to Gamabunta, who instead of one blade, has 2. See, Gamahero is the Leonardo of the toads, and is able to use its 2 katanas with massive amounts of proficiency, cutting through anything even remotely resembling a foe with relative ease. As the katanas that Gamahero uses are only dwarfed and just barely by a Susanoo's katana. That's not true, not just barely. Madara's katana literally cuts a mountain in half. Gamahero, alongside the other massive toads that Naruto summons to battle against Nagato, found itself in combat against Nagato's animal path, of which against it was able to hold its own for a very long time, cutting down Nagato's bull summoning and the multiple clones of Nagato's dog summoning. Though Gamahero, like the rest of the massive toads that Naruto summoned in this battle, was sent well beyond the borders of Konoha by the Devapath's Shirai Tensei. Now, after Gamahero, we have Gamaken. See, Gamaken is a very nervous toad who's constantly talking about how clumsy he is, though he's never appeared to be clumsy at all in any of the battles we've seen from him. See, Gamaken wields a giant sake cup as a shield and a giant sasamuta as a weapon. Now, sasamuta is actually something you'll still see in Asia today, specifically used by police. It's a fork of sorts, and while you won't see it pronged anymore in Asia, it's used to either pin people to the ground or pin people to walls to allow them to be arrested. On top of this, in the anime, Gamaken Sasamuta appears to be able to cause explosions when coming into contact with something, though this is never seen in the manga, and Gamaken, like the rest of the giant toads, is able to hold its own against Nagato's summonings. But Gamaken finds himself in a battle against Nagato's rhino, and eventually a bunch of Nagato's dog clones, all of which Gamaken is able to dispatch with relative ease. Now, after Gamaken, we have an actually important toad in Gamakichi, the personal summoning of Naruto. See, because while Gamabunta was technically summonable by Naruto, Gamabunta is more Jiraiya's summoning than Naruto's, in a very comparable way to how Manda was summonable by Sasuke, even though Manda was Orochimaru's summoning. Gamakichi is the oldest son of Gamabunta, the older brother of Gamatatsu. However, Gamakichi is different from Gamabunta in the same way that Aoda is different from Manda, in that Gamakichi shows much more faith in Naruto than Gamabunta did, at least in the beginning, but this is usually because when Naruto wanted to summon Gamabunta but wasn't accessing Kurama's chakra, he usually ended up with Gamakichi, though eventually that becomes less of a problem and more of an asset, as Gamakichi, by the time the 4th Great Shinobi World War starts, is roughly the same size as Gamabunta, and has a lot of the abilities and the ego of Gamabunta. I mean, by the time that the 4th Great Shinobi World War starts, Gamakichi even starts smoking the world's largest cigarettes. Who's rolling them? And thus, since Gamakichi does become kind of just Gamabunta too, a lot of the the abilities and strengths that he has run directly parallel with Gamabunta, like the fact that an adult Gamakichi wields a Tonto, just like Gamabunta. However, Gamakichi is much more tapped into the Senjutsu side about Mubuko than Gamabunta is, as by the time that part 2 of Naruto rolls around, Gamakichi is not only able to sense nature chakra, but also pull it in to a small degree, as he's able to combine Senjutsu with his already existing water release to create the starch syrup gun technique, which creates a viscous and sticky blanket of water that can pin his opponents to the ground. On top of this, in the anime, Gamakichi is shown to be able to use flame release, which he can use in conjunction with Naruto and his brother Gamatatsu to use their version of Toad Oil Goemon, which they refer to as Wind Release Toad Oil Flame Bullet. So in terms of power, there's really no reason for us to believe that an adult Gamakichi is any weaker than Gamabunta. In fact, his ability to tap into Senjutsu chakra and combine it with his water release could make a pretty good argument for him being stronger than Gamabunta. And thus Gamakichi, while kind of a meme in the beginning of his career, has become a bona fide member of Naruto's Team 7 three-way deadlock. But enough about the good brother, let's get to the less good brother. Coming up next, we have Gamatatsu. And Gamatatsu is pretty much the worst kind of animal you want to summon. An animal who doesn't care if you live or die, so long as after this mission, you can get some snacks. Gamatatsu plays a substantially smaller role in the manga than Gamakichi, as actually pretty much the only times we ever see Gamatatsu show up are anime-exclusive moments, like when him, Gamakichi, and Naruto use their wind-release Toad Oil Bullet to destroy Guren's Crystal Labyrinth. But Gamatatsu is, like Gamakichi, able to spew Toad Oil, use water release, and even use flame release, and thus he's still a pretty powerful summoning, though not even close to that of Gamakichi. But enough about toads, let's talk about anything other than toads. There's more toads on this list, by the way. But not right now, there isn't, because coming up next we have Garuda, one of Sasuke's numerous summonings. However, when it comes down to Sasuke's summonings, Garuda's probably the one we know the least about. Why does Sasuke have a contract with giant hawks? We don't know. It's even more perplexing when you consider the fact that for the majority of the time that we know Sasuke as a character, he could fly. Well, actually, not the majority. It's only between the end of Naruto and 138 episodes into Shippuden, I believe. So maybe he made a contract with the Hawks because he lost his ability to fly. Who knows? Wait, nope. I'm remembering something. Fourth data book told us about this. After Sasuke's battle against Itachi, he went and made a contract with Hawks because he lost his ability to fly. That one was way back there. Now, Garuda is technically a legendary bird that hails from both Hindu and Buddhist religions, as Garuda in both of these religions is referred to as the king of birds and also as the first bird. But in Naruto, it's just a really big hawk. I mean, it's a really big hawk that saves the day, like a lot, as pretty much any time that Sasuke is falling after his battle against Itachi, he just summons Garuda and he's saved. And without Sasuke summoning Garuda in Kaguya's lava dimension, something we will talk about in 1 second, a large part of Team 7 would have died. But yeah, of course, Sasuke summoning Garuda to stop Team 7 from falling into a river of lava technically proved that summonings can happen across dimensions, and therefore the idea of somebody being trapped in the Kamui dimension kind of fell apart because they could just be reverse summoned back somewhere. But hey, at least nobody fell in the river of lava. And oh yeah, Sasuke can apply his Susanoo to Garuda to protect him in case somebody like Kaguya is trying to kill the giant hawk keeping everybody alive. But outside of that, just kind of a bird. But enough about these birds. Nick, talk to me about these toads. Because up next we got Gerotora. Now, Gerotora is a scroll toad, a rare kind of toad that hails from Mount Muabuko, which is a type of toad that protects whatever written on the scroll that is its abdomen. And it protects whatever on that scroll until its contractor, the person who wrote whatever on its scroll, dies. And thus, in order to stay close to its contractor and make sure that secret is protected, Gerotora stays in the stomach of its contractor. So what does Gerotora protect? The key to the 8 trigram seal that's on Naruto's belly that's keeping Kurama inside of him. And the first time we see Gerotora is on the night of Naruto's birth when Minato summons him and draws the key on his stomach scroll. Minato then leaves this key to Jiraiya after his death. Now, the next time that we saw Gerotora is when Jiraiya wanted to allow Naruto to tap into more of Kurama's chakra, about 2 years after they started training together. And by releasing a little bit of the 8 trigram seal, Naruto is able to control up to a 2-tailed state. But Jiraiya wanted to continue pushing because the reason Minato used the 8 trigram seal in the first place and create a key to it that he gave to Jiraiya is because Minato believed in the child of prophecy that he had gotten from the great Toad Sage and believed that Naruto was said child of prophecy and would therefore need Kurama's chakra. And therefore Jiraiya told Gerotora that he needed to loosen Naruto's seal even more. But when he did this, Naruto releases a version 2 state that almost kills Jiraiya. And then, after Jiraiya's death, Gerotora eventually ends up with Naruto, as Naruto, after Jiraiya's death, became the last person who could make the decision as to whether or not the 8 trigram seal should be opened or not. So sure, Gerotora is just kind of a sentient scroll, but at least he's protecting your secrets. Oh god, we made it to the giant part of the list. Nagato has so many summon eggs! First up in the giant category, aka the Animal Path Summonings, we have the Giant Centipede. The Giant Centipede is just that. A giant centipede that's controlled by Nagato. And while this giant centipede appears to be strong enough to knock down entire buildings all throughout Konoha, it's absolutely juiced in a single punch by Sakura. Now technically in the anime, 3 of these giant centipedes were summoned, one of which was killed by Shikamaru, one of which was fought by Moeki, and one of which was killed by Sakura. But only one appears in the manga. Now this giant centipede was made to be eerily reminiscent of an omukade, a giant human-eating centipede that lives in the mountains according to Japanese folklore. Absolute nightmare fuel. Now after the giant centipede, we actually have a summoning that doesn't belong to Nagato. And that's because next up we have the giant clam. And if I hadn't already exhausted all of my your mom jokes earlier this video, trust me, there would have been one right in there. Now the giant clam is a summoning of Gengetsu Hozuki, the second Mizukage of the Hidden Mist Village. And the giant clam is kind of unique when it comes to summonings, as the giant clam has no personality. It can't move on its own and is completely loyal to its summoner. And this is important because it allows for the giant clam to be used in combat against Hidden Mist Shinobi, something most summonings with a will wouldn't have done, especially if they had the insignia of the village that they used to protect carved into their shell. See, the giant clam is capable of producing a mist that creates illusions, or genjutsu. And this illusion, or this genjutsu, makes it almost impossible for anybody in this mist to find the actual location of Gengetsu and the giant clam, as it creates a plethora of copies of the giant clam and Gengetsu amongst all of this mist. On top of that, even if you are able to get to the real giant clam, its shell is incredibly durable, as it was able to endure an attack from Inoki, though not particle style. And somewhat unsurprisingly, this giant clam is based off a Japanese and therefore Chinese folklore mythical animal. See, the giant mythical clam, known as Shin in Japanese, Shen in Chinese, is an aquatic shape-shifting dragon in the form of a giant clam that's said to be able to create mirages. In fact, the word mirage in Japanese, Shinkiro, literally means Shin's breath. But since we're talking about giant things that smell like the ocean, how many of your mother's jokes am I allowed to make? Next up, we got the giant crustacean. And the giant crustacean belongs to none other than Nagato. The giant crustacean is just that, a big old crab. It's like a Louisiana wet dream. But unlike the giant centipede, the giant crustacean is remotely interesting, as it's able to use water release, specifically water release wild bubble wave, which allows it to shoot a beam of bubble-like water that has a soap-like texture and therefore reduces the friction of the ground, causing enemies to slip. It also has the ability to wash away other jutsus, like a Todoil fire bullet. And thus it's actually with this technique that the giant crustacean is able to wash off Jiraiya's Todoil off of Konan, though it is later defeated by Jiraiya's wild lion mane technique, as Jiraiya is able to increase the hardness and length of his hair to make it resemble steel wires that it uses to kind of bind the crab, making that giant crustacean less of a crab and more of a rope bunny. After the giant crustacean, we have the giant drill-beaked bird, which is, once again, kind of like exactly what it sounds like. See, there's a big difference in this summoning between the manga and the anime. In the manga, this giant drill-beak bird soars through the skies at high speeds and slams into things using its incredibly long and powerful and hard drill beak, making it kind of like a sentient, massive arrow. However, in the anime, it's a biological B-2 bomber, as it's able to produce and I guess kind of lay a multitude of eggs that explode when they hit the ground. This summoning finds itself in a battle against Gamaken, but is subsequently destroyed and therefore desummoned when it's hit by one of Jiraiya's flame release attacks. It then comes back in Edo Nagato's battle against Edo Itachi, Killer Bee, and Naruto, where it becomes Nagato's way to get around after Itachi Kodo Matsukame's himself out of Kabuto's control, though it is once again destroyed by fire, ironically, when Itachi uses Amaterasu on it and Nagato to take them both down. After that, we got the giant multi-headed dog, which is the most well-known and therefore the most powerful out of all of Nagato's summonings. As well, on top of being a multi-headed dog, it was modified by Nagato using his amplification summoning technique ability. See, this technique allowed for Nagato to augment his own summoning animals. This ability allowed for Nagato to increase the power of his summoning animals if a certain condition was met, and the condition and therefore subsequent upgrade applied to the multi-headed dog was that once it received received enough damage, it would multiply, it would split up. On top of this, he also granted it the ability to come back together after being split up, and thus when it came back together, the dog would have as many heads as times it had split. It also had the ability to grow wings, shapeshift to avoid capture, and the ability to self-destruct. On top of this, out of all of Nagato's summonings, this summoning is by far and away the most resilient, as it not only was able to tank a Rasen Shuriken without disappearing, but it was also able to be hit with Amaterasu and stick around until Nagato was also hit with the same Amaterasu and was forced to desummon the giant dog. Now, its ability to split means that it battled against a lot of people, or I guess I should say a lot of toads, and also a lot of people, as this giant dog has battled against the likes of Gamaken, Sugiri, Jiraiya, Gamabunta, Gamahero, Naruto, Itachi, and Killer Bee. And in all of these battles, while it was often killed, whenever it was killed, it simply multiplied. And even by the end, and the last time we ever saw this animal summoned, it wasn't truly defeated. It's just Nagato was defeated. Meaning though, even though this multi-headed dog was massively underrated, it was probably one of the strongest abilities that Nagato had at his disposal, as this was just one, albeit the strongest, of the summonings that the animal path had access to. But we're not done talking about those summonings quite yet, because there's also the giant ox, which is you know, it's an ox, and it's an incredibly powerful and large ox that's able to knock down entire city blocks simply by jogging. And while the giant ox proved a formidable opponent against Jiraiya when he wasn't in his Sage mode, when he did enter a Sage mode, he was able to throw it with relative ease, snapping off one of its horns. On top of this, in the Pain arc, it was heavily damaged by one of Naruto's Sage art Big Ball Rasengans, and was subsequently finished off by Gamahiro. After the giant ox, there's the giant panda, which actually is a bit more than just a giant panda. See, the giant panda, outside of being a giant panda, also has the ability to harden its body, which allowed for it to act as a defensive barricade of sorts for the animal path. Now, if you ask me, a giant 60-foot panda doesn't necessarily need to be able to harden its body to act as a defensive barricade, because there's not a ton of things that can punch through that, but it is able to stop Jiraiya's Sage Art Needle Hair Senbon. Though, after it takes the brunt of this attack, it is desummoned. And I can't help but feel like it didn't really need to harden its body to accomplish that goal. But what do I know? I don't have a giant panda. And with that, we're done with, no, I'm kidding. There's a couple more of Nagato summons. Because there's also the giant rhino, because a giant ox wasn't good enough at running into things with horns. Though it does serve the exact same purpose. Though the one big difference between the giant ox and the giant rhino is that for some reason, the giant rhino has a small pair of broken wings on its back. It never tries to use them to fly, but they're there. Now, Gamaken is responsible for the disposal of this giant rhinoceros, both when Jiraiya fights against Nagato and when Naruto does it. Though when Naruto battles against Nagato, before Naruto is able to pass off this rhino to Gamaken to finish off, Ibiki does technically beat it in a battle. Though Ibiki is subsequently defeated by the animal path, and thus the giant torture cage he put the rhinoceros in is desummoned, and the rhino gets to go on a rampage again until it bumps into Naruto. Now, after the giant rhinoceros, we have the giant snake-tailed chameleon, which is the source of one of the more broken, yet one of the more fun jutsus in Shinobi Strikers. It makes you invisible, but it also amps your ninjutsu ability, so you just use a Majestic Destroyer Flame while invisible and does like half the damage of somebody's health bar. It's a fun build. It's also good for flag running. And much like in Shinobi Strikers, this chameleon has the ability to make itself invisible. But unlike in Shinobi Strikers, the only way the animal path is able to use it to be invisible is by popping into its mouth. And while this chameleon is able to become perfectly invisible, it can still be sensed, and Jiraiya was able to sense it using a barrier ninjutsu, specifically barrier canopy method, which is literally just N. It's Jiraiya creating a chakra bubble around him that anything that touches it, he's able to sense. On top of that, as a chameleon, it can climb on everything, so it can kind of be anywhere. Though, kind of like with any ability that makes you invisible in Naruto, even with the smallest amount of sensing or senjutsu chakra, you should be able to find it. And that's exactly what Fukasaku and Shima do, as they activate their Sage mode and identify its location, at which point Shima destroys its camouflage and Fukasaku cuts it in half with water release. And that... that's the last of Nagato's summons. There's so many. But enough about Nagato. We haven't talked nearly enough about snakes, which is why we're getting directly into the 3 giant snakes, which is almost as creative as all of the names that Nagato gave his summonings. Now, these 3 giant snakes are summoned by Orochimaru in the Konoha Crush arc. And while these 3 snakes might look like 3 individual snakes, they're actually merged together at the tail. And they were summoned by Orochimaru to breach the defensive lines of Konoha and destroy basically everything. Though it's implied that these 3 snakes are destroyed by Jiraiya, who uses his food cart destroyer technique to drop Gamahiro on them. Enough about ground snakes. I want a wet snake, also known as a salamander, because up next we have Ibuse. Ibuse. My bussy. I bus. You bus. Ibuse, I don't know. My god, we're deep into this video. Ibuse is a venomous salamander from the Hidden Rain and was the signature summon of Hanzo. See, the salamander is a comparable size to that of all of the summons of the 3-way deadlock. That is, Lady Katsuyu, at least as much as Tsunade was able to summon Manda and Gamabunta. However, the combination of Ibuse and Hanzo was enough to overpower the legendary Sannin and their 3-way deadlock. And if we're gonna sit here and assume that Hanzo was battling against the 3 people, that leaves Ibuse to battle against the 3 summoning animals of the 3-way deadlock, which could possibly mean this salamander is stronger than the 3 legendary Sannin summonings. And while you can sit here and say,
the legendary Sannin were at peak strength in this battle, and therefore Hanzo scaled too highly off this feat.
You know who was probably at full strength? Gamabunta and Manda, and obviously the amount of Lady Katsuyu on the battlefield is directly proportional to how strong Lady Tsunade was, but it still doesn't bode well for those summoning animals. On top of that, Ibuse has battled against Granny Chiyo multiple times. So where does all this power come from? Well, Ibuse is able to produce a poisonous mist from its mouth, and at such a volume that it can cover entire battlefields in mere moments. Now, since Hanzo was able to produce this same poisonous mist as a black salamander was taken from the river and its venom sac was placed inside of Hanzo as a child, Hanzo naturally wears a gas mask when on the battlefield to stop himself from being affected from this poison mist. Now, this poison mist, when inhaled by opponents, makes their entire body numb. It can prove fatal almost instantly if too much is inhaled. And Ibuse is able to produce this poison mist every 5 minutes. On top of this, Ibuse is somewhat similar to Naruto in the fact that it can conceal itself underground and pop up under enemies and swallow them whole, since in its mouth is where the poison comes from, falling into its mouth not usually for the best, as simply being in its mouth will make whoever's in there succumb to the effect of the poison eventually. So when considering the strength of summoning animals, the fact that Ibuse was possibly able to go against all 3 summonings of the 3-way deadlock simultaneously and win, that means this might be a top 3, top 4 in terms of strength summoning animal, which is nuts when you consider the fact that Mifune probably kills it in the 4th Great Shinobi World War. But enough about water salamanders, let's talk about ground salamanders, also known as ferrets. Look at them both anatomically, built very similarly. Because next up, we have my favorite summoning animal in the entirety of the Naruto universe, Kamatari, also known as the personal summoning of Temari. And it's a weasel with an eye patch and a sickle, which is A, not only sick, but B, based off a Japanese yokai, the Kama Itachi, which is the story of a sickle weasel that appears as whirlwinds in Japanese folklore that slice people with cuts that are painless. And thus, if somebody was ever looking down at their legs and noticed the cut that they didn't remember getting, it was said that a Kama Itachi flew by in an evil whirlwind and sliced their leg. Though the slices of Kamatari are far from painless. See, Kamatari is summoned through Temari's giant folding fan. And after Kamatari is summoned, it uses Summoning Quick Beheading Dance, which is a wind-style ninjutsu that's so powerful it's able to slice down entire forests. Basically, anything in front of Temari gets cut down at a speed so fast that the unaided eye, that is to say that a non-dojutsu eye, can't keep up with it. And he only ever shows up once in the manga, which is criminal. Because who wouldn't want more sickle ferret? But still, the act of again summoning a ferret that can cut down an entire forest in one fell swoop is one of the less talked about but most impressive things we see in part 1 of Naruto. But enough about things that aren't slimy, let's get back to the goop. Because coming up next, we have Lady Katsuyu, the head of the legendary sage area, Shikatsu Forest, and the personal summon of Sakura and Tsunade, and inarguably the strongest summoning animal out of the 3-way deadlock. A lot of people have difficulty in accepting the fact that Lady Katsuyu is the strongest out of these 3 summoning animals, and that's because Lady Katsuyu is seen to be more of a support summoning animal than an offensive threat, and while that is Pretty accurate. This is because we've never seen Lady Katsuyo's true size. See, while the generally summoned part of Lady Katsuyo is just about as big as Manda or Gamabunta or the biggest building in Konoha, Tsunade mentions during the 4th Great Shinobi World War that through the combined efforts of both her and Sakura using their Strength of 100 seal, they were only able to summon 1/10 of Lady Katsuyo. Now mind you, the 1/10 they summoned was bigger than the adjacent mountain ranges, and Lady Katsuyo, when liquefied, was able to place herself on the shoulder of every single member of the Shinobi Alliance, acting not only as a cell phone for the entirety of the Shinobi Alliance, but also healing all of them and refilling their chakra. On top of that, for offensive abilities, Lady Katsuyo has her tongue-tooth sticky acid attack, which fires out acid so corrosive it's able to melt rock with ease, and Lady Katsuyo is able to split into thousands, if not millions, of tiny slugs in order to avoid offensive attacks from other things, with the ability to reform into her giant form with incredible ease. On top of that, all of the clones that Lady Katsuyo splits into can serve as a medium for her summoner to channel chakra into the person that they're on, which means that both Sakura and Tsunade are able to transmit healing ninjutsu to people way further beyond their usual range through the medium of Lady Katsuyo. And the healing that Lady Katsuyo is able to do is so incredibly complete, she was able to bring 2 halves of Tsunade back together. But if Lady Katsuyo isn't able to heal you, she's able to put you in a stasis that puts you in a kind of coma that allows you to stay alive until somebody can get around to you to heal you. On top of that, because of her physical makeup and her ability to control her entire body on a molecular level, she is incredibly resistant to damage, as she was able to save multiple people from Nagato's Shira Tensei and Nagato's Chibaku Tensei. She was fast enough to protect Shizune, Ino, and Inoichi from Nagato's Rhino summoning, and if she really needs to, she's able to disintegrate her entire body into nothing more than viscous liquid. Broken, and if somebody out there had more chakra than Sakura or Tsunade and was able to summon the entirety of her, she'd be even more broken. We have only seen 10% of Lady Katsuyo's power. But I can't help but notice that we haven't talked about toads in a while, which is why we're about to talk about Kosuke, who's a messenger toad from Mount Mobuko, who's known for his high speed and high amounts of stamina. And Kosuke is meant to relay messages between Tsunade and Naruto while Naruto is training in Mount Mobuko. Cool! Can we talk about anybody else now? Of course we can. We can talk about the hardest name out of all the summoning animals on Earth, Kumo-Gumo, also known as the giant spider summoning used by Kidomaru, and also the subject of the majority of my 8-year-old's nightmares. Because what are Kumo-Gumo's abilities anyways? Probably just shooting webs and eating people, right? Well, I mean, yeah, and the creation of an egg sac that, when ruptured, releases thousands of spiders roughly the size of a small dog, all to perform an ability known as Rain of Spiders. And as these thousands of 20-pound spiders fall from the sky on whatever opponent Kidomaru is battling against, they all release string that slowly but surely falls on top of the opponent until eventually they're covered in this string and are immobilized. But now, if you're a childhood genius who's able to use 128 palms to destroy these hundreds if not thousands of spiders that are all falling down onto you, you should be good. Unless, of course, Kumo-Gumo decides that they're going to attack you directly, in which case, I mean, I guess it's still a good thing that you're a childhood genius who's able to use that same gentle fist technique to exploit Kumo-Gumo into an explosion of webbing. Even after you do destroy this giant spider, it will explode into a giant explosion of webbing that will then subsequently accomplish the goal of getting you weighed down with a bunch of spider webs so that Kidomaru can attack you directly. But then again, has there ever been a giant spider in any piece of media that wasn't complete and total nightmare fuel? I'd much rather fight a giant snake. Kind of like Manda, the next entry on our list. Now, Manda is the last member of the legendary Sannin's 3-way deadlock, and Manda was the boss of all of the snakes of Ryuchi Cave up until his subsequent death in the battle against Deidara. Now, Manda, as the boss of the snakes of Ryuchi Cave, existing just one step below the Great White Snake Sage, was incredibly snobbish and proud, believing himself to be the strongest out of all of the summonings. Now, the only reason that Manda decided to obey Orochimaru is because Orochimaru is the one person who went into Ryuchi Cave that he couldn't defeat. But this actually made Kabuto rather nervous because after Orochimaru lost his arms and therefore his ability to use techniques, kind of, he was afraid that Manda would no longer obey Orochimaru. But even still, every time Manda was ever summoned by Orochimaru or Sasuke, he complained about it, saying that he would require human sacrifices for the inconvenience of being summoned, or telling Orochimaru that if they ever lost in a battle, that Orochimaru should be prepared for punishment the next time they saw each other. Now, Manda was the boss of the snakes of Ryuchi Cave for a reason. He was the largest snake on Earth, with the only other snake ever being bigger than Manda being Manda 2, a genetically modified version of Manda. And because of this size, Manda is very easily the biggest summoning animal out of the three-way deadlock, at least in terms of what was summoned of Lady Katsuyu. He's very easily able to coil himself around Lady Katsuyu and is able to open his mouth wide enough to put the entirety of Gamabunta into it. And thus, in terms of the three-way deadlock summoning animals and what is summonable from them, he is technically the strongest. He was able to fight against not only Gamabunta but Lady Katsuyu simultaneously. On top of his incredible speed, strength, and size, Manda is also able to shed his skin, kind of like Orochimaru, if he incurs what he decides to be a deadly amount of damage. However, taking a deadly amount of damage is very difficult for Manda, as Manda was able to tank Deidara's C0 and still have a physical form put together enough that he was able to protect Sasuke from the entirety of the blast. And while this does kill Manda, the fact that he was even still there is very impressive. Now after Manda, we have Manda 2. Now Manda 2 is an enhanced clone of Manda 1, created by Kabuto. And thus, unlike Manda 1, Manda 2 is loyal to Kabuto, because Kabuto created it. Now Manda 2 is larger than Manda 1, so large in fact that it's roughly the same size as the island turtle. Well, I guess not roughly the same size, but the same length. And because this Manda 2 is so large, it's able to constrict the island turtle, being able to yank down the island turtle into the water. And on top of that, it's got legs, but not horns. So maybe its horns became legs. Who knows? But since we're already talking about turtles, let's talk about the only turtle summoning and the summoning of my guy, the only ninjutsu we've ever seen him use, Ningame. See, Ningame, while the summoning of my guy, is also the summoning of Tenten. Well, at least should have been the summoning of Tenten, but she got offended by Ningame and refused to enter a summoning contract with him. Now, what does Ningame do? Great question. Might Guy uses him as a double jump. That is, if Might Guy is ever in the air and he needs to get somewhere where he's not, he summons Ningame, and then he just jumps off him, and that's kind of it. He also breaks up one of the coolest and most anticipated fights in history, Rock Lee versus Sasuke. So he's just kind of there. But enough about all of that. Let's talk about something that we referenced all the way back at the beginning of this video. Kakashi's Ninken, of which Kakashi has 8. And those Ninken are, and I'm gonna have to read this because I don't have their names memorized, Pakun, Bull, Orochi, Shiba, Bisuke, Akino, Uhei, and Garuko. Now, we don't really know how Kakashi acquired these Ninken in the first place, though it is an incredibly popular theory that Kakashi's mother was an Inuzuka, and that Kakashi tapped into the ability of the Inuzuka by collecting strays and turning them into Ninken, as all of his 8 dogs are different kinds of dogs, who all serve technically different roles. And Kakashi does have the ability to summon each and every single one of these Ninken separately, as he most commonly does with Pakun, the only one of the 8 Ninken that's able to speak. However, this doesn't mean that Pakun is the only one of Kakashi's 8 Ninken that has a special ability, as all of Kakashi's Ninken have the ability to use a technique known as Summoning Earth Release Tracking Fang technique, which allows for Kakashi, if he ever is unable to find an opponent, to summon his pack of Ninken underground. They then use their sense of smell and ability to travel underground to find the opponent, jump out of the ground, and grab them. Kakashi most notably uses technique in a battle against Zabuza. Little fun fact about Kakashi's Ninken, they all have a design on their backs, on their little vests. And that design on their backs in Japanese is called a heno heno moheji, which is the sound that all of the characters in that face make when said all together. Now, children in Japan use this design as the face for scarecrows, which is Kakashi in Japanese. That's the reference. And while yes, I could go into the individual merits of every single one of Kakashi's Ninken, they're just dogs. And they can use Tracking Fang, and Pakun can talk. But speaking of weird dogs, coming up next, we got Nue. Now, Nue is a yokai created by the Root. Now, Nue was supposed to be an ultimate weapon, formulated through Hashirama's cells. Now, this project was spearheaded by Tanuki Shigaraki, but was passed on to his daughter, Sumire, also known as Class Prez. Now, since this was created by the Root, the core of the issue of Nue was started with Danzo, who realized the possible power of Hashirama's cells and therefore wanted to harvest them into a creature that could defend Konoha. However, after Danzo is killed by Sasuke, Tanuki Shigaraki, Sumire's father, grows to resent Konoha for letting Danzo die in the first place, and thus he decides to use Nue to destroy Konoha. However, a big part of the destruction of Konoha at the hands of Nue required somebody to tether Nue to this dimension, and thus Sumire was tied to Nue to be its summoner. Now, Nue is a monster that's attracted to the negative emotions of people, and once it finds those negative emotions, it selects that person feeling those negative emotions as its its target. And once it selects somebody as its target, it's able to prey on those negative emotions and take over that person's body, forcing them to give in to these negative emotions, making them the worst possible version of themselves. And only when that person is either able to overcome their negative emotions or is knocked out will Nue let them go. On top of that, since Nue is created from Hashirama cells, it's able to use wood release, though not at the level of Hashirama. My camera that's plugged in died. That's how long I've been filming. But Nue's absorption ability is so incredibly strong that both Sai and Kakashi advised Naruto against using his full power in the battle against Nue, as they feared that if Nue was able to absorb the entirety of Naruto's chakra, it would be unstoppable. But that wasn't even in Nue's strongest form. In Nue's fully tangible, full-grown form, it can not only regenerate lost limbs, but also teleport itself into rival villages and self-detonate to wipe those villages off maps. But it can also manifest tangible chakra limbs, like Naruto does with his KCM Tumo. But the downside of all of this power is that Sumire is unable to control it, which is why after the Sumire arc, Nue goes to a chibi level. But now, currently in the manga, Nue is much larger, roughly the size of a jaguar maybe, and thus with the more power that Sumire gets and the more control she gets over Nue, the bigger it gets. Until eventually, probably by the end of the manga, Nue will return to its original size and Sumire will be able to use it at its full strength. And God, am I hoping for that. After Nue, we have Shima, who we already kind of talked about when we talked about Fukasaku. So everything we said about Fukasaku kind of applies to Shima, however, instead of water release, she uses fire release. On top of that, Shima's also able to use something known as a fighting tongue bind, which turns her tongue into a snake-like entity that's able to snag people and hold them still. And with this tongue, she's also able to produce a highly corrosive mucus that was able to dissolve the camouflage off of Nagato's chameleon. On top of that, she's considered one of the great Toad sages for a reason, as she's not only able to enter sage mode, but she's also able to gather so much Senjutsu chakra that she's able to summon, and I have to read this, Gamabunta, Gamahero, Gamaken, Fukasaku, Gamakichi, and Naruto all at once. So yeah, she's the real deal, but not as real as our last and truly strongest summon on this list, Itachi's crow. Oh, Nick, it's just a crow. How powerful could it be? Great question. See, Itachi's crow, like his real, actual crow that followed him around ever since Shisui's death, is just a crow that Shisui beckoned out of the sky, pulled out his Kodo Matsukame, took out the eye of a crow, replaced it with a Kodo Matsukame, and then told to follow Itachi for the rest of his life. And this crow, though it is just a crow, follows Itachi for the next almost decade with that Sharingan constantly activated. See, what do we know about dojutsus implanted in somebody who didn't originally activate that dojutsu? They have no way to deactivate that dojutsu. This is why Danzo wears a wrap that covers a part of his face. He covers his Sharingan arm. This is why Kakashi pulls his headband over his eye. Because if you can't deactivate the dojutsu, the best thing you can do is cover it. This crow has no way to cover this Sharingan. And thus this crow, until eventually it uses Kodo Matsukame on Itachi as not only a Sharingan activated, but an MS activated, which means that this crow had an MS activated for over a decade. Oh, and yeah, it got shoved into Naruto and clawed its way out. So I guess technically you can make the argument that it was feeding off Naruto's chakra for a year or so, but that still doesn't explain how this crow was flying around with a constantly activated MS for over a decade. Unless, of course, you ride with the very popular and just now formulated theory that this was the real Sage of Six Feathers. And how does Itachi pay back this crow for flying around with the constantly activated MS for over a decade? Well, after it uses Kodo Matsukame on him, he burns it alive with Amaterasu. And everybody thinks Itachi's the good guy. And with that, we're done. We're done. There is 23 more summons we could have talked about if we included the anime and light novels. I'm almost hoping we never get a gold plaque. But if you enjoyed this detailed breakdown on all 45 manga canon animal summonings in Naruto, please tell me in the comments below. And while you're down there, tell me your favorite animal summoning we talked about. And also, like the video, subscribe to the page, and hit the noti bell. I think I've deserved it. I'm gonna go lay down.